Welcome to what I think is an absolutely fascinating part of teaching, and that is words. And when I say words, I mean, Lexis generally. Vocabulary is very interesting. Grammar is very interesting because in grammar you get that marriage of words and form. Yeah, and in that marriage of words and form, we get really, really nice meanings. What we've got to do as teachers, which we sometimes find very challenging, is we've got to give our learners access to lots of words in different contexts so that they can get the meaning. So the flexibility that there is in meaning is something that they can access as learners. So absolutely fascinating and quite a hard task for us as teachers. So in today's input, we're going to look at three different things. The first area is how we teach Lexis to young learners. Quite extensive. I hope you find that very, very interesting. The second thing, which is more for your colleagues than for you, and it's examples of common mistakes that teachers make in classrooms. So we'll have a look at that, and it might be useful for you to share that with some of your colleagues to help them in their progression as teachers. The third thing we want to look at is good examples of Lexis you can use in your classroom and in your classroom management. So a very good range that will help you as a teacher be more accurate, be more natural, and have greater flexibility in the language that you use in class. So let's look at some of the key things that learners need to do to be able to use vocabulary well. So clearly there are two areas. One is the meaning and the other one is use. So let's look first at some of the processes that they need to go through. So first off, they need to be able to recognize it and understand it. So that's pretty big, yeah. And you might say if they can do that, that's a very good start. And indeed it is. There are potential problems in that in as much as someone can recognize a word but not understand it. It's a little bit like seeing someone and you go, I know them, but you can't remember when or where or why or anything like that. And that's quite a difference in terms of your relationship with that word. You've got to be able to remember it and recall it when you need it. So if you're speaking, your learner is speaking or they're writing, they need to be able to remember that word or recall that word in order to use it well. And that brings up one of the key things that we need to do as teachers, and that is keep our learners' memory of the Lexis we have taught them, keep that strong. They've got to be able to use those words with correct meaning. And correct meaning evolves, yeah? So correct meaning when you're very, very young is really just the core concept of the word. But after a while, those words, they get different meanings, yeah? They get different colors. So the base meaning first, the thing that they get from you is very, very important. What is very important is that you put that word in context. So they experience it in stories, they experience it in audio. So they're not learning fixed meaning, they're learning flexible meaning. And that is really what correct meaning is. It's meaning in the context. They have to be able to use it in the right situation. When we say right situation, maybe we mean in some sort of spoken exchange, maybe we mean when they're writing it. And of course, it varies considerably, doesn't it? So if you're writing something in a message on WeChat, really, it does not have to be correct, yeah? At least most of the people I know, when they communicate on WhatsApp or WeChat, they just churn it out. They use voice transcription or whatever, but it's not really accurate, and no one needs it to be that accurate. because you can figure it out anyway. But what you have to be able to do is use it in the situation that is best. So if it's for very formal expression, well, then you're going to use particular kinds of language. If it's formal written, well, then it will be very particular kinds of language. If it's very informal, like in a WeChat, or if you're chatting with your friends, well, then there will be lots of differences in that language. You might drop your subject pronoun, for example. There are all sorts of things you might do that will make the language different according to the situation. You have to use it with, you don't have to, but you can use it with positive or negative meanings, or neutral meanings. You could take, for example, the word dog. Now, the word dog, and dog is one of my favorite animals, but you could say a guy's top dog or she's top dog, meaning that she's really very good or he's really very good. Or you could say he's a dog. Huh? Wildly different meaning. So we've got to learn that words have associations and use them appropriately. We have to be able to fit it somewhere. So where does that word go in a sentence? Yeah, is it in a subject position, a verb position, an adverbial, an object, a complement? I'm not suggesting that young learners need to know that, but they need to know where it fits in the syntax generally. Yeah, and of course you will achieve that through really good drilling. They need to be able to pronounce it, and that can be a bit of a challenge. Yeah, like how you can get your tongue around the words. And of course, as you know already, the key to good pronunciation is good exposure initially. Yeah, so they've got to hear it a lot and then get some practice in copying it. But if we want them to pronounce it, we're not just talking about pronouncing the word, we're talking about the word in a phrase or in a clause or in a sentence. So that's also a little bit of a challenge. And then of course, they need to be able to spell it, which is where that input on phonics comes in. So hopefully you've got a good idea how to do that. Okay, so let's look at the stages that you might go through or you might want to think about for your learners learning vocabulary. There are other things, but this is a useful set, if you like, a useful approach, a useful sequence that you can use when you're thinking about your teaching and learning. So the first thing that you want to do is make sure that your learners understand the meaning in context. Yeah. And I know that we keep saying context, but context is really important because it means that your learners get the idea that meaning is context dependent. You know that, I know that. Make sure that when they are exposed to language, that not only do you have it in context, so you have asked questions about the context, the story or whatever, but also that in addition to that, they're aware that when they use it, it's dependent on that context. They've got to learn the form, because in that context where you have isolated, where you have identified the vocabulary that they want to learn, then they have to know what they need to look at, what they need to listen to, because that shape, if you like, is the thing that the meaning is attached to. So you've got to show them the form, yeah, and the form, you've got to direct their attention to it. So what does it sound like? What does it look like? Then, needless to say, they need to practice and they need to memorize. Of course, practicing builds memory, but also memorization, or in the classroom, giving your kids time to memorize, will also aid the effectiveness of the practice. So an important part of the learning stages. They've got to consolidate the vocabulary, and of course in that consolidation you can probably rely on the vocabulary question lists that we have provided for you. You also need to determine in the recording of the vocabulary. So how are you going to record it? Are you going to put it on the wall? Are they going to write it in their books? Where is the vocabulary which they have learned going to go? You also need to recycle that vocabulary, because in that recycling, so you're putting it in a different lesson, and in that lesson what they're getting is an opportunity to revisit, review, and improve their awareness of that vocabulary. Then of course we want them to become good in terms of mastering their own strategies for learning vocabulary. I think the evidence is pretty strong that kids, learners who know how to memorize, who know how to process vocabulary, are going to achieve more than those who don't have good strategies. We have an expression which we've used for a wee while, and it's a really good one. I like it a lot, and it is context creates meaning. And as teachers, we can think about that when we are looking at language. Context creates meaning. So it's not as if the word is a single isolated unit. That word, sure, there is a core part of that word that has a consistent meaning, but the word changes according to the context, and it gets the richness of its meaning and its flexibility from the context. So how do you create the context? You can, of course, the best one is stories, narratives, dialogues, all of those things that create context in which the words are embedded. Now, you do not necessarily need to pre-teach the words before you do the narrative or the audio or the dialogue. Yeah, sometimes it's better to just do that with a task, yeah, and then explore the meaning afterwards. So first thing is get the context. When you've done that, you can also ask lots of WH questions, because sometimes kids don't pay a lot of attention to things, and what you want to do is get them aware of the fact that they are processing context, and this will help them later as well. So you might ask questions like, who is talking, what are they talking about, when are they talking, why are they talking, that sort of thing. They may not necessarily be able to answer all those, but they're getting the idea that the context is really important. So in that context, you have not only the vocabulary that you want, but also that vocabulary as being connected to other words. So perhaps an item of vocabulary, you want to identify the phrase so they get the idea that the word is not occurring alone, that it is in a particular piece of syntax, and that will really help their awareness of it. Of course, you will use all forms of media. You can use your books, of course. You can use any form of digital media, lots of good websites, good videos, all sorts of good software. You have your interactive whiteboards or brilliant TV screens, all of those. There are many, many, many. Use those. The more active that can be, the more sound, the more color, the better it is in terms of retaining the experience for the learners. You can, of course, support that context with pictures or objects, any form of real thing that you bring in to add meaning to that context. As the teacher, as you know, if in fact it is a story and you're reading it, well then your voice will be rich, your gestures will be big and clear, and all of those will add meaning to the context. When you have done that, or when you are doing it, you might ask for different ways to say the same thing, you know, like house, home, and so on. So see if you can introduce or take an opportunity to extend vocabulary by associating it with previously learned vocabulary. You don't want to confuse them into thinking that they're the same word. You can do similar words. You can also, very, very useful, um, do a translation just to check that they've got the meaning right. Don't rely too heavily on translation, and if you are using it and it's done, then say to your kids, okay, we're going to wait, and then you'll wait, say, 8 seconds, and then you'll ask for what the word means in what the word is in English. So you give the translation, what's the word in English, so you can be sure they're not just relying on the translation for meaning, but they have also locked away the original word. What you think your students know is important. What they do know is more important. So what you want to do with your Lexis is that you want to take opportunities to clarify the meaning. Yeah. And when you've clarified it, then you can feel with some confidence that your learners are going in the right direction. So you can think of the piece of Lexis and you can ask your students, where would you find this? Yeah, what situation would you find this in? And then of course, if they get the correct answer for that, you're going some way towards identifying that they have understood the meaning. You could of course just give them another situation in which that word occurs to help them with their clarity. If you're good at drawing and you can draw that word, or you can draw something that suggests that word or phrase, do it. It's a very engaging and interesting and interactive thing for you to do as a teacher. When you're doing it, try not to keep your back to the class. See if you can draw on the side so you can keep an eye on everyone. Yeah, you can give examples of things. So for example, you might be looking at the word huge. Yeah, and maybe this is the first time they've seen the word huge, and so you might say, our school is huge. Yeah, and the shop selling noodles outside is very small. Yeah, so that's an example not only of how to look at contrast or antonyms, but just an example of an example, if you like. Okay, you can use mime. So if it was huge, you could become big and monstrous like this and use that to mime the idea of huge. You could have a definition. Yeah, you could ask them what's another way to say huge, for example, or you could give them a definition. Something that is huge is something that is very, very big. You could use a flashcard with images of things that are huge and of course the word that goes with it. You can use synonyms, yeah? So you could have a little bit difficult with sometimes with words to find a synonym that is not more complex than the word you want to look at. So for a synonym, maybe it is very, very big, or you might have something like gigantic, which may be too complex, but the idea is it's like a giant, so it's huge. You might look at things like WH questions, so where can you see huge things? What does it look like? And so on. So use those WH questions like the ones we have identified in the vocabulary question list. And then of course, as I've mentioned already, use gesture. So tiny and huge. Okay, so what we've got here is a whole range of expressions, and I thought it might be good to look at these to help us understand how we can do it. Examples are always very good for us as teachers, yeah? So we have the word pumpkin, and we want to clarify that. We can clarify that by, for example, drawing on the board or having a definition. It's a kind of vegetable, if you like, or is it a fruit? um, or use a flashcard with the picture and the words, of course, or WH questions like, when do we eat pumpkins, what time of the year is important for pumpkins, and so on. To get away with something, think of a situation in which people can get away with something and perhaps describe that. You can look at a definition of getting away with something, which is, for example, do something and not get caught. You can look at synonyms. A synonym might be something like escape. Yeah, you could mime it. So you could pretend to go over and steal something and run away and not get caught and go, yeah, I got away with it. You could, of course, ask the WH questions that we've identified already. If you're looking at a word like backwards, well, then you can think of situations in which you get certain things going forwards and certain things going backwards. You could use gesture. And that's pretty straightforward, just pointing your finger over your shoulder. You could use a definition. Something that is backwards means that you are moving the opposite to forwards. I know that sounds really strange, but it would be hard to give a definition of backwards without forwards. So you could ask WH questions like, when does a car move backwards? Answer being when it's parking. What's an antonym? Of course, it's forward, and then you can do all sorts of contrasts by moving backwards and forwards in the classroom, and then, of course, adding mime. With a word like sympathetic, you might think of a situation in which you are sympathetic. So something bad has happened and you are there and you are sympathetic. That would clarify the meaning nicely for your learners. You could think of an antonym. You could describe one person as being sympathetic and another person as being cold-hearted. Yeah, you could mime sympathy, put your hands together and your head down and look a little bit sad, and that would be a good mime of sympathetic. You can ask WH questions or, of course, give a definition. So a person who is sympathetic is kind to you when things are bad, and they show that with their feeling. Yeah, you could look at the word plug, and simplest solution might be to draw it on the board or have a flashcard or bring in a plug or point to one in the classroom. Mime plugging something into the wall or giving a definition of a plug. You could do the same with the word tool. You could use flashcards. You could bring in examples of tools in realia. You could use a definition. A tool is something that you use when you are working, and so on. You could think of the word or the phrase to swerve. You could think of a situation in which you swerve. So my dad was driving down the road and someone ran out in front of him, so he swerved so that he didn't hit him. You could mime using the steering wheel in the car, and you could use a definition of swerve. Similarly, with a word like embarrassed, what you could do is think of a situation in which you feel embarrassed. You could say, oh, I was eating dinner with my friends and I dropped my tea and it went all over the table and I felt embarrassed. Yeah, you could mime what you look like when you're embarrassed. You could ask WH questions like, how do you feel when you're embarrassed? Or situations or definitions or so on. You could look at the word to snatch. You could think of a situation in which someone does that. So maybe a robber snatches your bag. Yeah, you could mime doing that. You could have synonyms like to snatch is to take something quickly. You could ask WH questions about who does it when and so on. You could look at a word like slim. And obviously slim would lend itself to contrast. So someone's slim, other person's not slim. Someone's big. Yeah, so you could have antonyms. You could mime being slim by drawing your arms closer together. You could ask WH questions and so on. Similarly with overtake, you could do what I've mentioned already, situations, mime, and so on. I don't mind. That's really interesting, isn't it? Because I don't mind frequently has a meaning that we're not sure of. Yeah. So you could get someone to do something, and you could kind of wave your hand to indicate that it doesn't bother you. You could have a definition of I don't mind, or possibly a translation would work well here. You could look at a word like a phrase like to kick the bucket, and in a phrase like to kick the bucket, clearly it's not about kicking a bucket. Yeah, it's a informal way of saying someone has died. Yeah, so this you have to think of the situation, and you would have to make it very informal. You could mime dying as long as that's not too inappropriate. You could use synonyms, WH questions, or definition. So that's a pretty good list, and hopefully will show you that with some degree of thought, there's a lot of vocabulary that you will be able to clarify for your learners. Okay, we have given, I think, reasonable attention, not perfect, but reasonable attention to meaning. And now we're going to look at form. The reason that we need to look at form is that that meaning has to anchor somewhere. That meaning has to connect to something. And if that connection is strong, then the retention will be good. So they've got the meaning, and now you want to get their attention addressed to the form. So there are two forms. There's the spoken form and there's the written form. So in the spoken form, they need to know what it sounds like and how to say it. Yeah, so the sound is something that you're going to model. So you will model it for them, and after you've modeled it, they are going to repeat it. So you will say to your learners, for example, I'm going to say this 3 times. You're going to listen, and then you're going to repeat it. And then you'll check, please say it, and so on. If you're really good, you will also say to your learners, okay, listen to your partner in a partner group that you have set up. Listen to your partner and tell them if their voice is very good, good, okay, or so-so. Yeah, and let them do that. You want the students in the group to develop some communication about the quality of their sound and develop their awareness of what good standard is. Then, of course, because you are very good, you will drill it. The big benefit in the drilling is, of course, that you get the sound of one word, but also you get the sound of the word in context, because it will change. Yeah. In that drilling, you will get intonation patterns, you will get sentence stress, you get lots of really valuable things. And in the substitutions, what you will get is good material for when they do their writing practice. Because if you've substituted across a structure, then they've got a lot of variety that they can use when they are writing. Of course, if you're good at writing chants, you can put the words in a chant, or you can search the internet for a song or a chant with those words in it. And you know, of course, that the benefit in the chant or the song is that everyone likes to do them and they're very memorable. So in terms of the written form, we want to look at how you spell it and how to use it. So what you might start by doing is writing the word on the board or displaying it somewhere, and then asking questions like, how many letters are there? Yeah. What's the first letter? What's the last letter? What's the middle letter? How many big letters are there? And in doing that, you're getting their eyes to frequently go over those shapes, those letters, to aid their memory and aid their analysis of the sound expressed in the spelling. So a really good thing to do. You can get them to either look at the board or in their books, copy it or trace it if they're at a very early level. You can, of course, include words that go together. Like, for example, if the word is tall, you could have, she is a tall girl. yeah, or he is a tall boy. So introduce those that go together, or what you can do, and presumably you have done this already, is you will import what they have done in their drilling into their writing so that they can look at that. You can also include grammatical features. So for example, if you're teaching goose, make sure you also teach geese. If you're teaching foot, make sure you also teach feet. A quick review on good drilling for two reasons. One, it's very important and in your technique set as a teacher, and two, because you will be putting it in your final video. Yeah, and we want to make sure that you get that right. Okay, so in terms of effective drilling, first thing is you know that meaning is most important, so make sure your learners know the meaning before you start the drill. Now, when you're doing a drill, make sure you provide a reasonably good natural model of the language. If you think your language model is not great, once again, download it from the internet or find someone whose language model is good, listen to it and copy it using some of the techniques that we've identified earlier for how you go about identifying what happens in sound. So where the voice is fast, slow, high, low, and so on. So make sure you drill chorally. So everyone in the class first, you're doing that before you drill individuals. You want that group practice first so people feel confident and practiced before they feel like they're being tested, which in fact they are. So when you are drilling, see if you can add emotion to the drilling. You know, add, if it's a sad drill, make it sad. If you're inviting someone to do something, be very excited and positive about it and get your learners to copy that. So change your face, change your manner when you're doing it. Use your hand movement, which we've mentioned already. Use gesture, use anything you can to identify where the intonation is and what the stress is. If you've got contractions, like for example, you don't want them to say I am, you want them to say I'm, then you put your fingers together. Yeah, you go I am, I'm. Yeah, use that to indicate contractions. And of course, always do substitution drilling. Substitution drilling is the key to developing a level of accuracy before they move into relatively fluent practice. To practice and to memorize is to be able to use. And that's the thing we really want to get to with vocabulary, is to have the active vocabulary that the learners have available to use. So some very effective techniques are to make sure that you do frequent reviews, so at the beginning and at the end of a lesson. They can be similar in many respects, and I know teachers do this very effectively. What you can do in that review is use the vocabulary question list. And we look at that a little bit further and later on in this presentation. We have looked at them before, but those vocabulary question lists in which learners ask one another questions about their choice of vocabulary is a very effective and interesting and varied way to review the target vocab. You can play all sorts of memory games with vocabulary. It can be something as simple as tell your partner what you remember about the number of items of clothing we studied last week, the number of animals, and so on. Just simple recall like that. Or they can be some of the standard games where you perhaps hold up a flashcard with the picture and ask for the word. Yeah, where you could do recall tasks, slow display of part of the image to elicit the word. You can do simple tasks where you put all the words in pairs down on the table, turn them over. They have to try and remember where they are and then pick up pairs. Lots of fun in an activity like that. Of course, as we've mentioned already, if you can sing songs or do chants that incorporate that vocabulary, that's even better. You can do grouping and sorting. So here are all the animals. Please sort them by size. Yeah. Please sort them by how much they eat. Please sort them by how dangerous they are. Yeah, so lots and lots of different things you can do which involve recall and processing of the vocabulary. When you're doing the vocab in review or practice or memorization, try as much as possible to incorporate senses, because in the real world, that's how we experience meaning. If you can, for example, imagine you're teaching the word supermarket. You might go, okay, let's imagine we go into the supermarket. What can we see? Good. And then your learners tell you what they can see. And then you can say, what can we hear? And that's very interesting. So you're getting them to recall or imagine what they would be hearing. What can we smell in the supermarket if we're bad? What can we taste in the supermarket? And so on. How does it feel when you're buying fish? That sort of thing. So some fairly simple techniques there for developing practice and memorization of vocabulary. For more mature learners, of course, review, beginning and end. You will use a different vocabulary question list. You will use one that's more challenging, requires more processing. You should give them quizzes, and we've mentioned that already on the course, where you can just jump on that website, design quizzes for your students where they have to match words and definitions and so on. So really simple thing to do. You can have all sorts of spoken activities, like imagine that you're with a group of learners and they've been learning business English. Yeah, then you could give them a discussion topic that focused on the language that you had already taught. So they would need to use that language to have the discussion. They can play all sorts of guessing games, and those guessing games could be what words did this person use when they were doing that, and they could try and guess what they are. You could ask them, as in the vocabulary question list, for synonyms and antonyms and so on. The last thing you can do is written activities in which they quite deliberately activate the Lexis which you have taught them. And that could be anything. That could be writing to friends on WeChat, it could be writing essays, it could be writing descriptions, any one of those that encourages them directly or indirectly to use the vocabulary that they have learned. Some years back, when we were developing an IELTS course and thinking about the best techniques for expanding vocabulary and reviewing vocabulary, that was the point at which we came up with the vocabulary question list. And the real reason for that was there's a vast amount of vocabulary for learners to be familiar with, and you need them to process it in different ways. There's lots of standard ways of doing it, but when you have a couple of students working together or a group working together where the questions change slightly, where the choice of word changes, then you can do a lot of review and keep it quite interesting. Because I guess that's one of the hard parts of reviewing vocabulary, and that is it can be a little bit unexciting. So the ones that we've got here you've seen already, so you can say to someone, please show me this. So there's a word, they can show it to you in the physical environment. You can ask for a translation. What is this word here in Chinese? Okay, please draw this. They can point to something in the book. Please tell me about this, pointing to something else. I say it, you find it in the book. Really good. Good for improving scanning skills and lots of quick reading. I point to it, you say it. So a really good way of checking PRON. And of course, key thing in this is that learners can choose which vocab they give attention to. Clearly, this is designed for very young learners or young learners who are developing their spelling skills, because sometimes we rely too much on phonics for developing spelling skills. And sometimes what we really need is attention to the letters on the page. And the simplest thing you can do with that is I say it, you spell it, or how many letters are there? They can ask one another, they can say the word, and then you've got to tell me how many letters there are in it. That's really cool. How many big letters? That is, letters that occupy the whole space between two lines, or letters that also go below the line. So they're the big letters. What's the middle letter? Yeah, that's a really good one, because to know the middle letter, you have to mentally review the whole word. Yeah. Can you spell it backwards? Absolutely fascinating in terms of good spelling, because it means to spell it backwards, you have to go to the end and then work back and then work back. And what happens is that each time you try to get to the next letter, you are reviewing the whole word. So a really good vocabulary question list to focus on spelling. As the learner's language level goes up, so does the quality of the questions. And you've got to mix them up a bit, but in this one here, we're moving towards greater awareness, if you like, and moving towards the awareness of the grammar. That is an important part of learning words, because we do want the meaning and the form. So you can start with simple questions like, one learner has got that list, and they say to the other learner, where can you find this? And they point to a lion or the library, for example. And then they have to tell them where they can find it. Or they can say, ask me a WH question about this. So once again, it could be about the library or the lion, like what can you find in the library? Where can you find a lion? What do lions eat? That sort of thing. Then you want to move towards the grammatical awareness, and you as the teacher probably want to model this. As a new start, you do this a number of times so that they can do it with one another. And of course, you go around, check, monitor what they're doing. So in this story, is this a thing, as in a noun? Is it an action or a verb? Is it describing a thing, an adjective, or is it describing an action, so an adverb? So we don't really want to use words like adverb and adjective too early, but certainly you can check the meaning by the terms that we're using there. Or with that group working with one another, or the pair working with one another, and this is a really nice build towards narrative skills. One of them chooses 4 words and says to the other, please make a story with these 4 words. It's a nice, cool way of deepening meaning and understanding of Lexis. You can see right away that this is for a higher level of language competence. So the question is, what is a word or phrase with a similar meaning? So you might have a word or phrase like finger. What is a word or phrase with a similar meaning to finger? Difficult, yeah? I think the answer might be digit. I think maybe. Does it have an opposite? So for example, the word finish, does it have an opposite? And of course, what is it? Then you have a word like fetch. What part of speech is fetch? I mean, it's said here that it's a verb, but you know, in a text, obviously you're not going to get that information. Can you make other parts of speech with it? And imagine the word is feel, and feel is a verb, and then can you make another part of speech with it? Yes, feeling, which is a noun. How do you translate it? Yeah, can you define it? Lots of good questions like that. Does a word, for example, have a prefix or a suffix that can help you with the meaning? Now, the prefix can help you with the meaning. The suffix is going to help you with the part of speech. Yeah. So if the word is cooperate, the prefix is co, and that means together, operate. So work together. How do you pronounce it? So the partner needs to pronounce the word. And then, of course, a nice little challenge, can you use it in a sentence? So these VQLs are things that you can use pretty much with any level. I just go through simpler questions, and it does create deeper understanding. It activates the passive vocabulary, and it adds variety to the review of Lexis. Of course, if you want to remember vocabulary or review it, you really need to have a good solid record of it. For some people who are blessed with excellent memories, maybe they don't need that, but almost all people do need vocabulary, kind of like cue cards. So you look at it and you go, aha, and you use that to jog your memory. So for younger learners, you can do things like, as the teacher, put a poster on the wall and you add the new vocab as it comes up in the lesson. You can add the new vocab and a description or a picture, that sort of thing, just so it's there and it's available. What you can do also is have vocabulary picture cards, so picture on one side, vocabulary on the other. Clearly, all of this is also available in good language learning apps, which you should be able to download, or your students should be able to download. Also for adults, we will have a similar thing where you can have vocabulary cards, so word on one side and on the other side the definition, synonym, antonym, use in a phrase, and so on. Really, really good for prompting and recalling memory. Notebooks as well, so a long list of the words that you have learned. A little bit difficult to deal with because notebooks often mean that you're doing the same thing again and again. Mind maps are particularly interesting, and you can do those on a regular basis. And that is, you start with a central word and then you add words as they come to your mind that are connected. So if you started with a word like the school, yeah, you might think school, classroom, students, you might think teachers, you might think interactive whiteboard, you might think air conditioning, you might think audio, and it goes on and on and on. So those mind maps are a really good way of connecting in your mind all that vocabulary that you want to recall.